All right, next, Together South Carolina, GP McLeer. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members, and I will go as quick as I can. I believe you have this in your packet, so I'll hit the highlights. My name is GP McLeer. I'm Executive Director of the South Carolina Arts Alliance, a 40-plus-year-old nonprofit, but I'm also a member of Together SC, the state's nonprofit association. I assist them with this proposal in front of you today. We have a couple of our own members in the audience as well. Ms. Naomi Lett from the United Way Association, and Nancy Lee from Habitat, South Carolina, and I believe Amber Stewart was here from the Community Development Association, and Brian Burrows from Institute of Child Success. Together SC represents over 800 nonprofit organizations across the state, as well as philanthropic partners and their supporting businesses. The nonprofit sector, as you can see, is about 90,000 employees across the state, and some other stats about the sector as you see there. We come to you today with essentially two requests. One is to create and fund at a meaningful level a named nonprofit grants program. You can substitute the name we have for anything that the legislature may consider, that focuses on two objectives. One, coordinating these funds with the state's legislative priorities that defined in ARPA, as well as completing some of the work done by the South Carolina CARES Act grant program that was done in the fall. And second, to strongly consider engaging this sector, the nonprofit and philanthropic community, to assist in the creation and implementation of this statewide grant program. While the state targets key needs with ARPA funds, such as broadband, job training, stabilization, infrastructure, tourism, and health and human services, our sector stands ready to assist the state in meeting these objectives. The state's goals so far are big picture and big ideas, but there exists another layer that's vital to the success of those endeavors, what we would call wraparound services. For instance, to get that broadband into a house and turned on, not only just at the corner, what ORS refers to as the take rate or adoption, not just marketing our rural gems, but supporting the festivals and events that draw tourists to towns, training for a job interview so that you can actually be trained on the job, accessing the care needed for yourself and your family, as well as understanding the impact of large infrastructure projects on local natural resources. Nonprofits provide a lot of these wraparound services to help make these priorities a reality. The state, of course, has the ability and duty to look at statewide solutions to statewide issues, something that many nonprofits can and should play a role in. It's equally as vital, though, to consider how the state can address, can create additional access for each and every community to provide funding that nonprofits can tap into and help achieve our state's vision at the local level in their own backyard. And that's what we're asking you to consider today. The American Rescue Plan allows the state to make grants to nonprofits for services that are eligible within ARPA's legislative language. And we encourage you to take advantage of this opportunity that aligns nonprofit funding with your overarching priorities. And we also encourage you to do this with the help of the sector. We see that we have some shared objectives with the state. One, focusing ARPA funds on accelerating our growth across the state, help stabilizing and growing the employment across multiple sectors, provide, if a nonprofit grant program is put in place, providing one that is in a simple, coordinated manner, and also limit the burden and growth of state agencies that may only see this as a 3-year window, as also achieve accountability and transparency and localized impact beyond what I know you guys are already looking at and obligated to under ARPA language. There's a couple of objectives we foresee a nonprofit grant program, including one, build upon the work and lessons learned from the CARES Act grant program. I'm going to hit a couple of those in a second. Be inclusive of all sectors in the nonprofit industry, not an exclusive few. Provide access to nonprofits in every corner of the state. And utilize the nonprofit and philanthropic experience that already exists in this state to help make that program successful. And then also create positive momentum and public awareness around this work being done to address key issues in our state. If you all remember, in the last year, you carved out $25 million for a nonprofit grant program and through the CARES Act. That was, I want to, first of all, make sure, I want to thank Marsha Adams at the Department of Admin, as well as her staff, for getting for accomplishing the unthinkable of getting that amount of money out in that short amount of time. That program, we learned a lot of lessons with, and we worked with Marcia and her team on distributing information to nonprofits across the state about looking at the data from the grants after they were awarded. There was $25 million available. $75 million was requested through that program, 1,500 applications with only 686 capable of being awarded with that $25 million. And that $50 million gap was as of November 2020. That gap is graded a day. Those funds in the CARES Act were reimbursement based. They were backwards looking. They were not forward facing like ARPA is intended to be. They were limited to 7 priority service areas, which left out a large swath of the nonprofit community and really the economy in general, and excluded those who received other federal support. In a couple instances, nonprofits who received small dollar amounts of maybe $5,000 in federal support from local grants were then incapable of accessing up to $50,000 at the state level, even though that $5,000 was there before the $50,000 was even approved by you guys. Grant awards, therefore, were a little inconsistent. The process was based on eligibility and checkboxes. It wasn't about knowing the applicants on the ground level or reviewing a robust narrative application. Final reports were also not required for that to determine the full impact of those funds. And then there's also, granted it was Christmas time, but there was little recognition of those funds for the great job that I think that the state did in supporting the sector that helps our state. One of our ask is making sure that we're involved in this process, and there are a lot of benefits to that. One, it offers the ultimate public-private partnership that's transparent, responsive, and accountable for achieving our state's mission. It reduces risk and limits cost by aligning these funds with industry standards and compliance that the nonprofit sector already adheres to. The nonprofit and philanthropic sector, the philanthropic sector grants out more money than the state has granted out in the CARES Act, and grants out more money than you would think across this state. And nonprofits are used to that extra level of transparency on a consistent basis. It will support wraparound services that enable sustainable growth and restoration of the workforce, many of the things I mentioned early on. Brings critical third-party accountability. By leveraging our sector to help advise and implement a nonprofit grant program, you're able to have an objective eye, one that's embedded in the field. Leverages existing trusted relationships and efficient grant systems. As I said, the foundations across the state grant out a lot more money than you would suspect, and have those local relationships that help that would help the state and make sure that those funds are getting to nonprofits doing really good work locally. It also builds long-term capacity statewide. These grants are meant to be forward-facing, and it can help get pilot programs, move from pilot to permanent, or create some new pilot programs around the state. And then obviously increases visibility and appreciation and able to tell the story of what the state's trying to do. There's some benefits to the state. One, we encourage you to name it something that's special to South Carolina. We want to emphasize state leadership over federal leadership with this program. It would encourage employment growth, not only in our own sector, which saw job losses in multiple areas, but also help provide, like we've said, those wraparound services that help the family feel more stable in their home, in their health, in their career. It reduces the burden and growth of state agencies over a 3-year window if you're able to lean on our sector for things like distribution and implementation. And then lastly, it provides grants, and lastly, there's a lot of bullet points in this, but provides grant in a simple, coordinated manner. Uses a competitive model. Could help prevent duplication, which I can talk about if you'd like. Collection and analysis of impact data and stories can be done. We could leverage Guidehouse's oversight to reduce that risk and take their advice on what needs to be accounted for. Increase transparency and accountability and visibility in communities, and most importantly, though, this localized impact that would be accessed across the state. I want to give you an example, and then I'll stop for any questions of how what I'm talking about can play itself out. Everyone has been talking about broadband infrastructure. It's a critical need in our state if we want to be competitive, healthy, educated, and connected. State ARPA funds dedicated to broadband are more than likely going to broadband infrastructure, pipes in the ground, and getting internet access to as many street corners as possible. But what about getting broadband into a house on a device with a person who's trained on that device and can afford that access? That last part, this adoption of broadband, is critical to the success of the state's broadband initiatives. And not only where no internet access exists in the rural parts of our state, but also in places where it's just not yet fully adopted. There are pockets in our most populous cities that still can't afford or can't access or don't know how to use broadband-enabled devices. Similar realities exist in health and human services, housing, tourism, conservation, education, workforce training, food security, and every other legislative priority that you guys are considering. We believe that an investment of about $100 million over 3 years, specifically for these localized support channels, would provide appropriate funds to advance our state's priorities in every community. Just as important, though, is the distribution method, which we would ask you to allow us to work with your staff. Katie's been great in helping us through the CARES Act process and getting us here today help us articulate that a little bit better. By leaning on our nonprofit and philanthropic sectors, the state can create a grant program that helps fill gaps in every community across the state, and we believe that we can do it with the utmost transparency, accountability, and a high return on investment for the state's dollars. Just want to finish with, these are a list of, within a couple days, of ready and willing partners, all of whom are members of our network, who are willing to help craft something for the state to consider. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll pause for any questions or comments.
Any questions? Representative Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. And forgive me, I'm not very familiar with Together SC, so I just had a couple of questions. I guess the proposal is that Together SC would run the grant program for the other, or for the nonprofits?
I think our first step is to work with you guys on crafting what the program could be and allow the legislature to set those parameters. We do believe that there's an opportunity to lean on specifically on the philanthropic sector. Together SC does not make grants. We're not a foundation. But we represent a lot of them, but lean on those networks across the state to potentially assist the state in distributing those funds.
So tell me, Together SC, and I'm sorry, again, I'm not very familiar, so I was trying to read on your group. You guys have, you represent nonprofits around the state. What, they pay you a membership fee, or how does that work? How do you become a member of, how does a nonprofit become a member of Together SC?
Yeah, consider us the Chamber of Commerce for nonprofits and the existing network.
So,
same way that a chamber would operate.
Okay, and I know you said you represent about 800 nonprofits. I have no idea how many nonprofits we have in South Carolina, but I'm sure it's way more than 800. So I guess my question is, in your proposal or with what you're thinking, how would that look for some of these nonprofits that maybe aren't a member of Together SC, or perhaps I know with a lot of nonprofits, especially smaller nonprofits, like with smaller businesses, they may not have the funds to be a member of Together SC or the chamber. So I'm curious, how would that look? Are they going to have to be a member of Together SC and pay membership fees to your organization to be eligible for this grant program? Or
no, ma'am.
How do we make sure that we don't leave people behind and we're picking winners and losers, or how does that work?
Much like the CARES Act grant program, which Together SC worked on with the legislature, that it's open to any nonprofit in good standing in the state of South Carolina would have access to these funds. Some of those folks who got CARES Act grants are not Together SC members. And many of those who would apply for a nonprofit pool would also not necessarily be Together SC members. We are the only nonprofit association across the state that has a statewide presence. But we obviously, not every nonprofit is a member, not every business is a member of the chamber.
Right.
It's the same thing. We want to make sure that whatever is proposed is accessible to as many nonprofits as possible based on the parameters that the legislature would want to see.
Okay. Well,
We are advocating just that there be something included that involves a nonprofit perspective in the planning and implementation so that it can be leveraged more effectively at the local level.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate
ma'am.
your presentation, and thank you for what you do. I do have some questions and concerns that that we can discuss and kind of work on.
Yes, ma'am.
With some of this, but thank you. I appreciate what
Thank you so
do.
much.
Any other questions? All right, thank you for your presentation.
Mr.
Appreciate
Chairman.
that.